Dawn rose dimly over the flat lands of Friesland, the mist lying low like a shroud upon the runways of the Luftwaffe airfield near Leeuwarden. The war had turned the mornings grey, engines coughed in the distance, and every horizon seemed to hum with the sound of distant machines. Then, from beyond the fog, came something unfamiliar, a deep, uneven roar that did not belong to any German aircraft. It was slower, heavier, wounded. Ground crews looked up. Through the veil of morning came the shape of a giant, limping across the sky. Its 4 engines coughed black smoke, one propeller windmilling idly. Officers shouted orders. Anti-aircraft crews ran to their guns. But as the aircraft descended, they hesitated. Its silhouette was broad, its wings impossibly long, its tail tall and square. This was no Junkers nor Heinkel. It was something else. The tower signaled a warning. The machine was heading straight for the field. Searchlights swept across its body, revealing a torn, burned fuselage streaked with soot and oil. Then, through the drifting fog, the insignia came into view. White stars on a blue circle. American. The order to fire never came. The aircraft was already too low, its landing gear half extended, its approach desperate but deliberate. With a groan of metal, the giant struck the runway, bounced, and settled with a thunder of rubber and sparks. Its engines sputtered, 2 still alive, their propellers cutting the mist in rhythmic defiance. German soldiers ran toward it, weapons ready. The smell of burnt oil filled the air. The cockpit windows were shattered. One engine still hissed with escaping steam. When they reached the fuselage, they found the doors open, the crew either dead or vanished into the fields beyond. Inside, silence, empty seats, bullet holes riddled the walls. The machine looked less like a bomber now, more like a survivor that had fought its way home and lost its bearings. In that quiet moment, the Luftwaffe officers stared not at an enemy, but at a mystery. A fortress of steel had fallen from the clouds, battered yet whole. For the first time in the war, Germany had captured a complete B-17 flying fortress, and with it, the first real glimpse of the weapon that would soon darken their skies. But none of them yet understood what kind of enemy they had just invited onto their airfield. By morning, the fog had lifted, and the airfield buzzed with curiosity. The strange American bomber stood in the pale sunlight like a wounded leviathan, vast, scarred, and still. German mechanics circled it in cautious awe. What they saw defied experience, an aircraft riddled with holes, its skin punctured by cannon fire, its wings torn by shrapnel. Yet the landing gear had held. The engines had run. Somehow this monstrous machine had crossed hundreds of miles of hostile airspace and survived. Technicians began their inspection with surgical precision. They tapped on armor plating that rang like iron bells. The cockpit, cocooned in layers of reinforced glass, looked more like the bridge of a warship than an airplane. Inside, the controls were battered but intact, a network of cables, hydraulics, and wiring that spoke of industrial mastery. The German engineers, accustomed to the elegance of the Messerschmitt, were struck silent by its brute sophistication. They found ammunition belts coiled like serpents through the fuselage, feeding guns from every angle, 13 machine guns in total, each manned by a crewman with a defined role, each overlapping the other's field of fire. The Luftwaffe men exchanged glances. This was no clumsy, heavy bomber. This was a fortress in every sense of the word, an aircraft designed not to flee from fighters, but to meet them head-on. "It's a flying castle," one mechanic murmured, his gloved hand tracing a bullet hole that had stopped just short of the pilot's seat. The phrase spread through the hangar like a whisper of revelation. Even damaged, The B-17 radiated an air of defiance, a sense that it had been built to endure, not to escape. Pilots and officers gathered to study the weapon's defensive arrangement. 10 men had flown this aircraft, each bound to the others through an intercom system and a single doctrine: protect the formation at all costs. Where German pilots prized individual mastery, the Americans had engineered collective defense. The intelligence staff arrived soon after, taking notes with quiet urgency. Orders came swiftly from Berlin. The bomber was to be moved to Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's secret testing ground. There, Germany's finest engineers would dissect it, fly it, and learn its secrets. But as the trucks rolled the great machine away, no one on the tarmac realized what they were truly sending to Rechlin. It was more than a bomber. It was a lesson in how wars would now be fought. By 1943, the war had ascended into the clouds. What began as battles for cities and borders had become a contest for the sky itself. From the airfields of East Anglia, thousands of American bombers lifted off in endless waves, their silver wings glinting in the cold morning light. Their mission was simple in command, but monumental in effect: to cripple the industrial heart of Germany in broad daylight, to prove that precision and courage could bring an empire to its knees. The targets were no longer distant names on a map. Regensburg, Schweinfurt, Bremen, cities of steel and smoke, became daily coordinates of destruction. Columns of flying fortresses climbed toward formation altitudes, their engines merging into one unbroken sound, like the pulse of an approaching storm. Below them, the factories that forged Messerschmitts and tanks continued their rhythm of production, unaware that death had already taken flight toward them. The Luftwaffe answered each incursion with ferocity. From airfields scattered across occupied Europe, Messerschmitt Böffer 109s and Focke-Wulfs clawed upward to meet the invaders. Pilots like Adolf Galland and Gerhard Barkhorn led squadrons with the assurance of men who had once ruled the skies. Their confidence was not arrogance, but the residue of experience. For years they had been the hunters. Against slower Soviet bombers and unescorted raids, the German fighter had been supreme. Each side entered battle with faith in its own doctrine. The Americans trusted in altitude, formation, and machine discipline. The Germans trusted in skill, speed, and instinct. From cockpit to cockpit, from engine roar to gunfire, the war above Europe became a dialogue between two civilizations, one industrial, one martial, both burning their youth to prove a vision of strength. But faith could not protect metal. By mid-1943, even victory carried unbearable cost. The fortresses returned home with wings shredded and crews lost. German squadrons, too, landed in silence, their flight lines thinning with every sortie. Thousands of lives vanished into contrails that drifted across a continent. The air war was no longer a campaign, it was a crucible. The battlefield had become invisible, suspended between heaven and earth, where nations measured their endurance by the smoke that followed their planes. And yet, within this brutal new frontier, a single captured bomber would soon teach both sides what true supremacy meant. Long before it became a symbol of defiance in the European sky, the Boeing B-17 had been born in a different era, an era still learning the grammar of air warfare. Its origins reached back to 1935, when engineers in Seattle drafted blueprints for an aircraft that could do what no bomber had yet achieved: fly higher, farther, and longer than any interceptor could follow. It was conceived not as a weapon of chance, but as a machine of endurance, a machine that would make persistence a form of power. The prototype, elegant in its simplicity, took shape in aluminum and ambition. Where other nations built bombers to deliver destruction, Boeing built one to survive it. Its frame was heavy, its wings broad, its skin layered in armor. At first, the Army Air Corps saw extravagance. Later, they saw prophecy. The machine could fly on 3 engines, sometimes 2, and still find its way home. In its resilience lay a philosophy, not of glory, but of method. Every angle of the B-17's body was designed for defense. 13 50-caliber machine guns covered every approach, their fields of fire overlapping like a living geometry of protection. The nose, tail, belly, and dorsal arcs formed a sphere of mutual vigilance. The man in the Sperry Ball turret, suspended upside down beneath the fuselage, became both guardian and prisoner, his world reduced to gunsight and horizon. No gunner fought alone. Every position existed to guard another. The Americans called it a flying fortress, and the name was not an exaggeration. But its true strength lay not in its armor or firepower. It lay in the men who learned to think as one. The fortress was a study in cooperation. The pilot trusted the navigator, who trusted the bombardier, who relied on the gunners to keep the formation alive. Every crewman's task was small, but together they formed a single mind, a disciplined unity of motion and will. Their tactics reflected the same idea. 12 bombers in close formation did not behave like 12 machines. They became one organism. The pattern of their flight, the arcs of their guns, the rhythm of their bombing runs, was the physical expression of teamwork. A fortress alone could be destroyed. A fortress in formation could annihilate the sky around it. Training schools across America drilled this truth relentlessly. Crews learned to obey systems, not instincts. Discipline replaced improvisation. The B-17 was not a stage for heroics. It was an instrument of precision. In the cold logic of its design was a moral. Strength was not the courage of one, but the coordination of many. To its creators, the fortress was more than an airplane. It was the embodiment of an idea, that technology and teamwork, fused by discipline, could make men invincible. And in the skies over Europe, that idea was about to be tested against the Luftwaffe's faith in individual brilliance. A duel between 2 philosophies, each convinced it understood the future of war. In 1943, the Luftwaffe still carried the confidence of its early triumphs. Its doctrine was built on a singular idea, that wars in the air were won not by machines, but by men. German pilots were trained to be hunters, not formations in the sky, but lone predators, each guided by instinct and precision. They were heirs to a creed born in the First World War, mastery of the machine through mastery of the self. Their training emphasized initiative. A Luftwaffe pilot was expected to fight as an artist, not as a cog. He studied the silhouette of his prey, learned the angle of attack that would deliver one burst, one kill, then disengage before danger could find him. In this doctrine, courage was expressed through independence and victory through elegance. It was an ideology of skill, and skill, they believed, could overcome any machine. So when the first B-17 formations appeared over France and the Low Countries, the German aces regarded them with professional curiosity, not fear. The flying fortress was large and slow, a target that seemed to invite destruction. The standard tactic, approach from the rear, fire from close range, break away, had worked against every other bomber before it. Why not this one? Early encounters seemed to confirm their confidence. Over Lorient and Lille, formations of fortresses were torn apart. Gunners who panicked under pressure made easy prey for the Messerschmitts diving through their arcs of fire. Flames marked the path of their descent. Pilots landed that evening with the satisfaction of familiarity. The fortress, they reported, burned like any other. But beneath those reports lay small details that few yet noticed. Squadrons were returning with higher losses. Ammunition consumption had risen sharply. Attacks required greater coordination and more fuel. Each engagement lasted longer, the bombers' defensive arcs thicker than predicted. The B-17 did burn, but it took time, precision, and risk to make it so. Still, German command dismissed the warning signs. The Luftwaffe believed that courage and the genius of its aces would outlast American numbers. Fighter production focused on agility and performance, perfecting machines like the Bf-109 and FW-190, aircraft built for brief, violent encounters, not prolonged defense. Endurance, both mechanical and human, was left to the enemy. Within the marble corridors of the Reich Air Ministry, optimism remained untouched. Intelligence officers concluded that America's daylight bombing campaign was unsustainable. The raids were too costly, the distances too vast. The winter of 1943, they predicted, would end the experiment. But the experiment did not end. The formations grew larger. The factories across the Atlantic never slowed. For every fortress that fell in flames, another rose to take its place. What the Luftwaffe did not yet understand was that they were no longer fighting men alone. They were fighting a system, one that turned industry itself into a weapon. And soon, the skies would show them what that system could do. By the summer of 1943, the air war over Europe had reached a scale no one had imagined. The Americans had grown bolder. Each week, the bombers flew farther, deeper, and in greater numbers. Their targets were the lifeblood of the Reich, the factories that forged its engines, its bearings, its aircraft. And in August, they struck two of the most vital, Regensburg and Schweinfurt. The operation was unlike anything attempted before. From airfields in East Anglia, more than 300 flying fortresses lifted into the morning haze, their wingtips gleaming in the rising sun. The formations stretched for miles, rows of silver machines, their engines synchronized into a steady thunder that rolled across the sky. They climbed into the thin air above the continent, the vapor trails of their ascent weaving into a white lattice against the blue. Below, the Luftwaffe scrambled. Radar screens glowed with the signatures of the approaching armada. Squadrons of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s clawed upward in response, climbing fast, climbing hard. The Germans knew these bombers. They had faced them before, but never like this, never in such disciplined masses, never with such order. When they reached the formation, the battle unfolded, not as a hunt, but as a collision. The first wave of fighters dove from altitude, confident in their tried-and-true tactic, attack from the rear, where bombers were weakest. But the fortresses were no longer vulnerable. As the Messerschmitts broke through the contrails, they flew into a storm of tracers. 13 guns per aircraft, multiplied by hundreds of aircraft, created a geometry of death. The sky shimmered with converging streams of .50 caliber fire. Pilots described it later in one phrase. It was like flying into a furnace. For every bomber that fell, 3 German fighters were torn apart in the crossfire. The air itself seemed to burn. Wings shattered. Engines erupted in mid-air. The neat doctrine of precision attack, perfected in the early war, dissolved against this wall of steel. One pilot radioed back in disbelief. They fire in every direction at once. The fortress formations moved as if alive, maintaining their spacing through turbulence and chaos. Each crewman watched his sector, his field of fire overlapping the next, forming an invisible dome of protection. It was not the courage of individuals that kept them aloft. It was discipline. Every gunner knew his arc, every bombardier his sequence, every pilot his formation. Together, they created something the Luftwaffe could not understand: mechanical unity born of human coordination. The Germans attacked again, this time from the front, head-on, closing at a combined speed of over 600 miles per hour. The B-17s met them with precision bursts from nose-mounted twin 50s, cutting through the oncoming fighters before they could align their shots. What should have been a slaughter of bombers became a massacre of interceptors. By midday, the sky over southern Germany was a panorama of burning contrails and drifting parachutes. The bombers continued to their targets, dropping tons of high explosive on Regensburg's aircraft factories and Schweinfurt's ball-bearing plants. The Luftwaffe had fought with everything it had, but the results were undeniable. When the surviving German pilots landed, their fuel exhausted and their nerves frayed, they said little. Many would never fly again. Those who did carried a new understanding that courage could not pierce the fortress wall. In the officers' mess that evening, the talk was hushed. The phrase repeated among them was quiet, almost reverent. You cannot outfly mathematics. The myth of German air superiority, the faith that skill could conquer mass, had begun to crack, and as the wreckage smoldered across the fields of Bavaria, a darker realization settled in. The Americans had not just brought machines, they had brought an industrial rhythm that could not be outfought, only endured. At Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's engineers began to prepare. The captured fortress had arrived, and the study of this new kind of war was about to begin. August arrived like a verdict. The battered flying fortress, its American markings crudely masked, rolled slowly along cracked service roads toward Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's secret proving ground. The base sat in a ring of pine and secrecy, a place where prototypes were probed and doctrines were found wanting. Mechanics rolled out toolboxes, officers in field gray walked beneath hangar eaves, and the great bomber, still smelling of burnt oil and cordite, came to rest beneath the cold light of an experimental bay. For men who had spent years measuring enemy strength in kills and sorties, the sight provoked a different response. Curiosity edged with professional unease. Engineers moved like surgeons. Panels were unbolted, plates were pried back, rivets were counted. They traced the bomber's skeleton, the hydraulics that steadied its flaps, the reinforced bulkheads that ringed the crew compartments, the labyrinth of conduits that carried power to its many turrets. Where German designs prized minimalism and pilot feel, the B-17 revealed another logic: redundancy. Systems duplicated, circuits rerouted, fuel tanks were self-sealing, sealed again with baffling precision. Each discovery read like a manifesto of survivability. The men at Rechlin, used to repairing machines fashioned for speed and grace, found themselves studying an aircraft that had been engineered expressly to resist death. But it was the defensive apparatus that held their attention longest. They watched as mechanics freed jammed turrets and fed ammunition into belts that slid with mechanical whisper. The turrets were not crude emplacements, but electric-driven systems, servo motors spinning gun mounts with a smoothness the Germans had not expected. A dorsal turret swung with a quiet authority. The tail guns fit into a structure that absorbed recoil with little shudder. The intercom wiring ran like a neural network through the fuselage, connecting bombardier to pilot, radio operator to tail gunner, every man able to hear and be heard. Here, in this web of voice and steel, was a doctrine made manifest. Men linked to men, guns linked to arcs of fire, all coordinated by the simple insistence of communication. Colonel Peterson, a test pilot whose opinion carried weight in both hangar and ministry, climbed the narrow ladder into the cockpit. He had flown Mi-109s and the heavy Dornier prototypes. He had seen German frames give and German doctrines hold. He ran his fingers over the instrument panel, noting gauges that were robust, not ornamental, switches labeled for redundancy, trim tabs that hinted at how the machine would fly when wounded. He watched a mechanic cycle a turret and listened to the faint, layered sound of the entire defensive array coming online. When he lowered himself from the cockpit, he did not smile. Instead, he said, almost to himself, "It is an air fortress indeed." The words moved through the hangar like a small admission of defeat. Orders from Berlin were precise and impatient. Fly it, test it, break it if you can. The Reich demanded answers. How did this machine absorb punishment and still reach its target? Could German cannon or tactics be adapted to reduce it to scrap? Rechlin's pilots prepared flight plans not as displays of bravado, but as experiments in method. Engineers documented every servo twitch, every hydraulic lag. Technical scribes filled notebooks with measurements so exacting they read like a calculus of mortality. There was no heroism here, only procedure. Identify the system's limits, and then determine how to exploit them. Mechanics painted over the blue stars with the pragmatic efficiency of men marking a specimen. Where hands had been smudged with American grease, new coats of paint laid the plane down in German crosses. In mess conversations, someone joked, not unkindly, that the captured bomber would be christened the Dornier 17 Captured Edition. The joke was thin consolation. Beneath it lay a complicated shift. The men who had come to study a wreck found themselves, in small, involuntary increments, admiring the machine before them, its stubborn survivability, the logic of its defenses, the clarity of its systems. Respect does not require agreement. What began as forensic analysis, a project in reverse engineering, slowly acquired the shape of reluctant admiration. At night, under lamps that smelled faintly of oil and solder, engineers argued less about how to destroy the B-17 than about how to emulate its practical strengths. Questions that began as technical, where did redundancy matter most, which turret responded fastest, moved toward the philosophical. What does it mean when a nation turns industrial discipline into bodily defense? Rechlin's whiteboards filled with diagrams, experiments multiplied, doctrines were tested against the cold arithmetic of bolts and bearings. Still, the mission remained clear. Learn its secrets so that enemy formations might be broken more cheaply in lives and machines. The captured giant would be flown, pushed to its limits, and catalogued. The men at Rechlin would measure its courage in instruments and its will in wire, and when they were ready to fly it, they would discover something no test could have predicted, not simply the strength of its armor, but the cohesion of the idea that animated every man inside it. The morning chosen for the flight was calm and clear, a rare peace in a summer that belonged to fire. The captured B-17 stood on the runway at Rechlin, its olive-drab finish now repainted in Luftwaffe gray, its tail still carrying faint ghosts of American insignia beneath the new black crosses. To the untrained eye, it looked like a German aircraft awaiting another test, but to those who had studied it for weeks, it was something else entirely, a puzzle of foreign genius, ready to speak in its own language of power and precision. At its controls sat Hauptmann Hans-Werner Lerche, one of Germany's most skilled test pilots. He had flown everything the Reich had built, from nimble Messerschmitts to lumbering Dornier, and he understood machinery not as a collection of parts, but as temperament. As the engines of the fortress ignited one by one, the airfield trembled. Each engine's deep note blended into a steady, cathedral-like hum. Lerche rested his gloved hands on the throttles and felt the vibration pass through the frame, not violent, but confident, like the heartbeat of a giant. The takeoff surprised him. Despite its size, the bomber rolled forward with composure. It did not leap from the ground, but rose deliberately, as if it had considered the act and found it well within its strength. Heavy but steady, he would later write, the fortress climbed smoothly, its four right cyclones pulling it upward with unhurried authority. Lurcher had expected sluggishness. Instead, he found balance. At altitude, he began to test the controls. The yoke responded with mechanical honesty, firm but predictable, no hidden instability. He pushed the aircraft through gentle banks and shallow dives, measuring its character. It was not agile, yet it possessed something rarer, stability born of purpose. The wings held their line even through turbulence, the engines running in perfect unison. Everything about it spoke of endurance rather than elegance, the philosophy of a nation that prized reliability over flair. He switched on the intercom system, curious about the voices of the dead men who had once used it. The cabin filled with the clean crackle of electricity and the clarity of microphones linked from nose to tail. He could speak to every position at once, bombardier, navigator, tail gunner, as if the machine itself was a single body animated by many minds. To the Luftwaffe, whose aircraft relied on hand signals and instinct, this unity of sound was revelation. Each man, Lurcher wrote later, is not alone. He is one voice in a choir of defense. Then came the simulations. Other pilots circled the fortress in Messerschmitts, staging mock attacks. Lurcher watched the gunners, technicians standing at their posts, swivel the powered turrets with mechanical precision. The arcs of fire overlapped perfectly, the tail covering the belly covering the nose. Every approach angle invited response. To dive upon the B-17 from the rear, the classic German tactic, was to step into a storm of bullets. From the front, it was no better. Even when the gunners were firing blanks, the geometry of their protection was unmistakable. After an hour of testing, Lurcher landed the fortress, taxied to the hangar, and shut down the engines. Silence returned to Rechlin, heavy and reflective. Mechanics crowded around as he climbed down the ladder, his flight jacket streaked with oil, his face unreadable. Someone asked how it flew. Lurcher thought for a moment before replying. "It flies as though it were unbreakable," he said quietly, "and to shoot one down, you must fly through hellfire." His written report was longer, more measured, but no less revealing. He noted the strength of its construction, the logic of its systems, the efficiency of its crew coordination. Yet beneath the technical analysis, one line stood out, a sentence that captured more than design, more than engineering. "This is no ordinary aircraft," Lurch concluded. "It is an idea made of steel." At Rechlin, that idea unsettled everyone who read it. For the first time, German pilots spoke of the American bomber not with scorn, but with respect. They had tested the body of the enemy and found in it a kind of spirit, a discipline that could not be shot down. And soon, that spirit would return to the skies, not as a single captured plane, but as thousands, darkening Germany's horizon with the steady promise of inevitability. For weeks after the test flight, the captured B-17 stood inside a hangar at Rechlin, stripped to its bones. Engineers approached it not as soldiers, but as archaeologists of a superior civilization. Each day they uncovered another layer of complexity, another small revelation about how a nation across the ocean had turned mass production into an art of survival. The first discovery lay within the wings. Fuel tanks, once thought vulnerable, revealed a secret few had expected. When punctured, the interior lining swelled into a tar-like seal, closing the wound as if the machine were healing itself. Self-sealing fuel tanks, a technology known but rarely mastered in Germany, had been perfected here to a degree that astonished even the most seasoned mechanics. A single bullet could no longer doom a bomber. The fortress did not rely on luck, it relied on design. Then came the armor plates. Instead of heavy slabs bolted crudely to the frame, they found carefully balanced sections positioned with mathematical precision, enough to shield the crew, but not enough to break the aircraft's symmetry. The Germans had built aircraft for performance, trusting their pilots to outfly danger. The Americans had built for endurance, trusting their machines to withstand it. In that contrast lay a difference of philosophy, one born from scarcity, the other from abundance. The dissection moved inward. Technicians traced cables that ran like veins through the fuselage, carrying electricity to every gun mount. Each turret was a masterpiece of engineering logic, powered, stabilized, and able to rotate in seconds. When one engineer climbed into the dorsal turret and pressed the controls, the guns responded instantly, smooth, obedient, alive. "It moves like thought," he whispered. In comparison, the German turrets, hand-cranked and sluggish under pressure, seemed relics of another age, but it was the Sperry Ball turret that silenced the hangar. Suspended beneath the belly of the aircraft, it looked almost delicate, a sphere of glass and steel, barely large enough for the man who fought within it. The engineers lowered it carefully, studying its motorized ring and electric elevation system. To crawl inside was to enter another world, the world of a gunner sealed in motion, seeing the war through curved glass, turning 360 degrees in defense of 10 lives. It was terrifying and beautiful. They marveled at the ammunition feeds too, endless belts running through chutes, every link identical, every case polished to perfection. There were no rough edges, no misalignments. Every component fitted seamlessly with the next. Here was the difference that haunted German engineers. The Americans could produce not just quality, but uniformity. The perfection of one machine was not a miracle, it was a guarantee. When Colonel Peterson visited the hangar that afternoon, the chief technician showed him the turret's electric drive and said simply, "They've mechanized courage." The phrase lingered in the air. It captured the essence of what they were seeing, a weapon designed not to rely on the momentary brilliance of a man, but on the enduring certainty of a system. Reports to Berlin reflected the unease beneath their admiration. The fortress was not invincible, it could be destroyed, but every bolt, every wire, every turret proved something more profound, that the United States had found a way to mass-produce reliability itself. The B-17 was not the triumph of genius, it was the triumph of organization. In those hangars, surrounded by riveted panels and technical diagrams, the Luftwaffe engineers understood what their pilots were beginning to feel in the skies, that they were fighting not merely aircraft, but an idea, the idea that strength could be manufactured faster than it could be destroyed. They documented everything, sent sketches and samples to Berlin, and continued their dissection in silence. Yet each new discovery eroded a little more of their old certainty. For years they had believed themselves the masters of aviation, precise, daring, unequaled. But the fortress stood as quiet contradiction, the product of a civilization that valued unity over individual brilliance, process over passion. And as the engineers filed their reports, a question began to form, one that no machine could answer. How does a nation built on artistry defeat a world that has learned to build perfection by the thousands? At Rechlin, the analysis soon moved beyond the machine. The engineers had charted its structure, mapped its systems, and admired its craftsmanship. But they sensed there was something larger at work. The B-17 was not simply a marvel of engineering, it was a manifestation of a philosophy. To understand the aircraft, they would need to understand the doctrine that guided its use, the method behind the miracle. In a hangar converted into a lecture hall, Luftwaffe analysts gathered around diagrams pinned to wooden boards. They traced lines of fire drawn from the fortress's gun mounts, their arcs overlapping in delicate geometric precision. It was an elegant logic, a defensive network built not on reflex, but on mathematics. The engineers called it the circle of fire. Each bomber covered the next, every weakness sealed by the strength of another. Alone, a B-17 could die easily. Together, 12 of them became nearly invincible. They built models to simulate the pattern. Tiny aircraft suspended from wires, positioned in formation as American crews flew them over Germany. When they overlaid the fields of defensive fire, the effect was staggering. There were no blind spots. What had once been dismissed as rigid flying now appeared as a deliberate, living mechanism, the embodiment of cooperation. The Luftwaffe's own doctrine had evolved from a different world. German fighter squadrons valued autonomy. Each ace was expected to maneuver independently, to trust his own instinct rather than the collective order of the group. It was an art of improvisation, elegant but fragile. Against uncoordinated bombers, it had been devastating. But here, facing the fortress formations, that artistry faltered. When test pilots simulated attacks against mock formations, they found themselves trapped in a paradox. The traditional method, diving from behind and below, placed them squarely into the path of the tail and waist gunners, whose fire converged with deadly efficiency. Even when approaching from the front, the defensive power of the nose-mounted .50 calibers shredded the attack before it reached effective range. "There is no gap," one pilot reported, "only interlocking death." The engineers began calculating angles and trajectories, searching for a mathematical weakness. None appeared. The defensive coverage, combined with the aircraft's durability, created what one officer called a wall of air and lead. The only strategy that seemed to hold even theoretical promise was a concentrated frontal assault by multiple fighters, a suicidal tactic that demanded absolute coordination. It was the aerial equivalent of a submarine wolf pack, striking in unison and withdrawing before the response could organize. But unlike Dönitz's U-boats, there would be no ocean to hide beneath, no night to cover the retreat. As the data accumulated, a deeper realization began to take hold. This was no coincidence of design. The B-17's strength was not in its guns or armor, but in its alignment with the same industrial logic that had produced it. The Americans had built a weapon that reflected their society, a structure where every component, mechanical or human, worked toward a single function. To fight one B-17 was to fight 10 men. To fight 100 was to fight a system. Colonel Peterson reviewed the findings with quiet unease. His report, intended for Göring's staff, was stripped of rhetoric. "The American bomber force," it read, "functions as an organism. Each part supports the next. Attacks against isolated aircraft are ineffective. The entire formation must be considered a single target, one vast machine." That sentence marked a turning point. For the first time, the Luftwaffe acknowledged that the Allied bombing offensive was not a passing nuisance, but a strategic transformation, the industrialization of warfare itself. Courage, precision, and experience could not compensate for what Germany lacked: scale. Still, the analysts pressed on. In one of the final exercises, a flight of German fighters was ordered to intercept a mock formation flown by test pilots at Rechlin. The bombers carried cameras instead of bombs, the fighters live ammunition. The results were devastatingly clear. In less than 5 minutes, 4 of the 8 interceptors were destroyed. The rest broke off their runs, their pilots shaken. Even in simulation, the wall of fire felt impenetrable. Afterward, in the debriefing room, silence hung over the officers. They had not merely witnessed superior technology, They had seen a doctrine so methodical, so absolute, that it mirrored the very spirit of the enemy's war economy. "They have done," one intelligence officer remarked, "in the air what we did at sea. They have turned discipline into a weapon." That night, the Rechlin report was compiled and sent to Berlin. It was blunt, almost severe in its tone. "We underestimated them. The American system of aerial warfare is total in conception and execution. It cannot be defeated by valor alone." In that single admission lay the first fracture in Germany's confidence. For the Luftwaffe, mastery had always been personal, the domain of the ace, the duelist, the artist. But now, facing this airborne architecture of teamwork and machine precision, even the best pilots felt the ground shifting beneath their wings. And soon, the war that had once been fought by men would be decided by systems, and by which nation could build them faster than they could be destroyed. By early 1944, the lessons learned at Rechlin had reached the front. What had begun as technical fascination now translated into desperation. The Luftwaffe could no longer ignore the reality that the flying fortress was not merely a bomber, but the centerpiece of a new kind of warfare, one defined by system, not skill. The response, hurried and improvised, revealed both the brilliance and the futility of a nation fighting against arithmetic. Engineers and pilots gathered in workshops across Germany, searching for ways to counter the B-17's wall of fire. The result was the Sturmbock, a modified version of the Focke-Wulf FW-190A8, an interceptor refitted for the brutal business of fortress hunting. Thick armor plates were bolted behind the cockpit, the canopy reinforced with bulletproof glass, and the wings armed with twin 30mm cannons designed to shatter bombers with a single hit. In theory, it was the answer. In practice, it was a weapon born from necessity rather than doctrine. The Sturmbock was heavy and slow, but its pilots flew with grim resolve. They closed into point-blank range, firing into the tight American formations until their guns overheated. Some, when ammunition ran dry, simply rammed the fortresses they could not destroy. German propaganda would call these men Ramjäger, the ramming fighters. But even heroism could not offset the odds. For every bomber brought down, several interceptors fell before reaching effective distance. Courage, however immense, was no match for geometry. The Americans adapted faster than Germany could respond. Escort fighters, once unable to accompany the bombers to their deepest targets, now arrived in strength. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang changed everything. With its long-range tanks and high-altitude performance, the Mustang turned the tables entirely. The hunter became the hunted. From 20,000 feet, the sky that had once belonged to the Luftwaffe began to shift its color. German formations that once rose confidently to meet the enemy now faced swarms of P-51s sweeping the approaches, clearing the air for the bombers that followed. Dogfights broke out across contrails that stretched for miles. The outcome was no longer in doubt. The Luftwaffe, bled of its best men, began to dissolve in slow motion. Production lines could not keep pace. For every German aircraft that reached the front, 3 American bombers and 4 Mustangs replaced it. The very factories meant to rebuild the Luftwaffe were themselves targets, reduced daily by the same fortresses that German engineers had studied in fascination only months before. It was the cruel symmetry of industrial war. The weapon you admired today would destroy your world tomorrow. By spring, even the most decorated aces could see the truth. Galland, Barkhorn, and others flew missions through skies now dominated by silver swarms. They returned to airfields half empty, their squadrons broken, their machines worn to exhaustion. No amount of experience, no refinement of tactics could alter the fundamental imbalance. The Americans had made their machines replaceable. The Germans had made their men indispensable. It was a difference that, by now, determined the outcome of the war. At Rechlin, the captured fortress still stood. Its frame stripped and studied, its parts carefully catalogued. Engineers continued to measure, to record, to theorize. But none of it mattered. The knowledge had come too late. No innovation could match the tempo of American production, the rhythm of an economy that turned resources into weaponry faster than Germany could recover from its losses. The sky, once an arena for individual valor, had become the proving ground of systems. The Luftwaffe's culture of mastery, its faith in the single ace, had met an enemy that valued the collective, the replicable, the relentless. By the end of that year, the conclusion was inescapable. The Germans had not been defeated by superior pilots or by better tactics. They had been defeated by scale, by the cold, mechanical truth that industry had become the new soldier. And so, above the ruins of their own cities, German officers looked upward at the endless streams of fortresses crossing the daylight sky. They had learned every lesson their enemy could teach, and discovered too late that the real weapon had never been the aircraft itself. It was the world that built it. By autumn, the tests at Rechlin were complete. The captured fortress had been flown, dissected, rebuilt, and flown again. Every switch had been measured, every gun sight recalibrated, every cable traced to its origin. The Luftwaffe had learned everything it could about the enemy's machine. And yet, when the final report was compiled for Göring's office, its tone was unlike any technical document that had come before. There was precision, yes, but there was also something quieter beneath it, something that sounded almost like respect. Test pilot Hans-Werner Lerche, who had spent more hours in the fortress than any other German aviator, submitted his summary with meticulous care. The handwriting was steady, the phrasing clinical, but buried within the data and diagrams was a line that carried the weight of revelation. The defensive coordination of this aircraft is astonishing. To the men who read it, it was not simply a statement of design, it was a recognition of principle. In the officers' briefing room, a small group of colonels and engineers gathered to review the findings before forwarding them to Berlin. Charts covered the walls, showing the fortress's firing arcs and armor schematics. Each line was a reminder of a truth they had resisted for too long. "We have nothing like it," one officer admitted quietly. His words broke the uneasy silence that had settled over the room. There was no shame in his voice, only the clarity that comes when arrogance finally gives way to understanding. Others nodded. They had studied the fortress long enough to see that its strength was not in its thickness of steel or the number of its guns. Those were symptoms, not causes. Its true strength lay in its unity. Every man, every station, every circuit existed in relationship to the others. It was an ecosystem of order, a human and mechanical harmony, designed not for glory, but for endurance. One officer, a veteran of the early air war, summed it up with simple conviction. "Its strength," he said, "is not its guns, it is its teamwork." The words hung in the air like a confession. For years, the Luftwaffe had worshipped the idea of the individual, the lone ace, the daring tactician, the artist of combat. It had built its culture around men who could turn instinct into victory. But here, in the shell of an American bomber, that culture had found its mirror opposite, and its undoing. The fortress had no ace, it had no hero. It had 10 men who fought as one, and in that unity lay a power no single pilot could match. To the Germans, whose doctrine was born from the myth of individual mastery, this realization was more unsettling than any weapon. It was not just a new kind of airplane they faced, it was a new kind of world. In the hangar, as the engineers prepared to retire the captured B-17 from testing, there was no sense of triumph. They walked its length in silence, their hands brushing over the patched skins and riveted seams. Some lingered near the Sperry Ball turret, staring into the empty glass sphere that had once contained a man. They imagined what it must have been to fight there, suspended in air, seeing death in every direction, yet holding your ground for the sake of those beside you. Admiration replaced envy. These were professionals, after all, men who understood craftsmanship when they saw it. They did not envy the Americans their resources or their numbers. They respected them for their discipline, for the precision of their design, for the way they had turned cooperation itself into a form of defense. The tone of the Rexlin report reflected this quiet change. It no longer sought to condemn the enemy's machine or diminish its achievements. Instead, it acknowledged them. It recognized that what Germany faced in the skies was not mere opposition, but a reflection of its own limitations, the inevitable cost of believing that genius could replace system, or that courage could outlast machinery. When the report reached Goering's desk, he is said to have glanced at its summary and set it aside. The conclusions were already evident in the air itself. Outside, the roar of distant engines rolled over the countryside, the sound of fortresses returning once more, in formations that darkened the noon sky. And at Rechlin, where the first had once landed by accident, the officers who had studied it stood in silence, watching them pass overhead. By the start of 1944, the sky above Germany no longer belonged to the hunters. The Reich's air defense network, once the pride of the Luftwaffe, had begun to collapse under the weight of exhaustion. Fuel reserves dwindled, spare parts vanished, and every victory seemed to cost more pilots than Germany could afford to replace. What had once been the realm of elite aces and flawless machines now dissolved into attrition, the slow drowning of an air force that could no longer keep pace with the rhythm of industrial war. The warning signs had come quietly, almost politely. Squadrons that took off at dawn returned with half their numbers. Young men, barely trained, replaced veterans whose names had once filled propaganda reels. Their instructors told them to trust instinct, to rely on courage, but courage required opportunity, and opportunity demanded fuel, the one resource Germany could no longer spare. By spring, some fighter units received only enough aviation gasoline for a single flight each week. Training became theory, and theory could not shoot down bombers. In the east, the Red Army advanced relentlessly. In the west, the daylight sky itself had turned hostile. The B-17 Flying Fortress, once a singular machine studied in secrecy at Rechlin, now came in endless swarms, hundreds at a time, their silver skins catching the sun like 1,000 mirrors. The formations stretched from horizon to horizon, escorted by squadrons of P-51 Mustangs, whose range had erased the final advantage of the Luftwaffe. The hunters had become prey in their own airspace. Berlin, once untouchable, became a routine target. The city's air raid sirens no longer carried panic, only fatigue. At midday, the capital darkened under the shadow of high-altitude bombers. Columns of smoke rose from industrial districts where Germany's engines of war had once roared. The citizens learned to live with thunder overhead, a thunder that came not from storms, but from the steady heartbeat of 4,000 Wright Cyclone engines. The sound of the enemy had become the sound of inevitability. At Rechlin, where the first captured fortress still sat in disassembly, the engineers listened to that sound with grim irony. They had once touched its metal, admired its precision, understood its purpose. Now the same aircraft filled the sky above them, too many to count, too distant to resist. The machine they had studied had multiplied into a fleet that no amount of genius could undo. For the pilots who still flew, the air war became an act of endurance rather than mastery. They fought without illusions, climbing into cockpits on half-empty tanks, taking off from runways cratered by bombs. Many never reached altitude. Others found themselves overwhelmed before they could even engage. When the fortress formations appeared, blotting out the sun, there was no longer strategy, only survival. Those who lived to return found the bases changed. Fuel drums stood empty, hangars were silent, and the faces around the briefing tables grew younger with each passing week. The Luftwaffe's heart, once defined by precision and confidence, now beat unevenly, powered by remnants of belief. The war in the air had become a mirror of the Reich itself, proud, brilliant, and breaking. For the civilians below, the transformation was unmistakable. They had once looked to the sky for protection, for the shriek of the Messerschmitts defending their cities. Now they watched the same sky darken beneath fleets of bombers. What had been abstract numbers in newspapers became the firestorms that consumed their neighborhoods. To them, the fortress was no longer a symbol of foreign engineering. It was the weather of their destruction. And among those who had once examined that captured B-17, who had measured its wingspan and sketched its gun placements, silence replaced pride. The very men who had once spoken of its design with fascination now huddled in shelters as the roar of its descendants passed overhead. Their study had become prophecy. By winter, the last illusion had vanished. The Luftwaffe, the hunters of Europe, could no longer hunt. The air belonged to others now, to the bombers that came by day and the night fighters that followed. The nation that had taught the world to fear its wings now feared the sound of engines above its own cities. The hunters had become the hunted. When the war reached its final year, the B-17 had become more than an aircraft. It was no longer just an instrument of bombardment or a line in a production schedule. It was a symbol of how an idea, when joined to discipline, could change the meaning of power itself. The flying fortress was not merely a product of steel and rivets. It was a structure of belief, a reflection of how a free society organized itself for survival. Its very design was democratic. 10 men, 10 stations, each dependent on the others. The bombardier could not succeed without the navigator. The navigator could not chart a course without the pilot, and the gunners could not defend without the calm of the radio operator who kept their voices linked. It was a microcosm of the system that had built it, a network of ordinary people united in extraordinary purpose. Where one failed, another compensated. Where one was wounded, the rest adjusted. In this way, the fortress represented something more profound than its designers could have imagined, the fusion of human cooperation and industrial logic. It was the opposite of the Luftwaffe's creed, where mastery was measured in the skill of the individual, in the intuition of the ace. The Germans had built their air force as a gallery of talent. The Americans had built theirs as an orchestra. And when the tempo of war accelerated, it was the orchestra that could sustain the rhythm. At Rechlin, long after the bombing raids had turned Germany's sky into a corridor of flame, the men who once studied the captured fortress came to understand this contrast in quiet ways. They had not been defeated by a superior pilot or even a superior weapon. They had been defeated by an organization that treated every worker, every technician, every crewman as part of a whole. Industrial democracy had created what military aristocracy could not: continuity under chaos. The Luftwaffe's doctrine had been built on brilliance, but brilliance cannot be mass-produced. Its greatest minds had designed wonders. Its finest pilots had written legend. But its foundation, the single-minded heroism of the individual, could not endure a war fought by factories. As the months wore on, Germany's genius became isolated by its own pride. The Allies' strength multiplied, Germany's diminished. By contrast, the B-17 embodied endurance through unity. Its creators had designed it to be repaired, replaced, replicated, not revered. Every fortress that fell was not a tragedy of singular loss, but a node in a living system that absorbed destruction and kept advancing. Each new production run was a resurrection. In the logic of the machine was a moral. Permanence belongs not to the brilliant, but to the organized. For the men who once tested that captured B-17, this realization carried weight. They had touched its armor, studied its geometry, flown its slow, steady climb into the clouds. They had measured it as engineers, but in the end they understood it as historians. It was a mirror held to two civilizations, one defined by hierarchy and pride, the other by cooperation and process. The mirror did not flatter, but it told the truth. After the war, fragments of the captured fortress remained at Rechlin. A wing rib here, a turret shell there, mute reminders of the moment when technology had revealed character. Those who had seen it fly spoke of it not as an enemy's weapon, but as an artifact of a new age. They built it to endure, one engineer said quietly, and it endured them all. The fortress had outlived its crews, its factories, and the ideologies that sent it into battle. What survived was the principle it embodied, that unity of purpose, more than genius or glory, is what sustains nations in the face of catastrophe. When the war finally began to unravel, the captured B-17 at Rechlin sat silent. Its engines had cooled for the last time, its propellers locked in place, the grey paint of its German markings fading beneath the dust of a collapsing Reich. Around it, the airfield emptied, first of pilots, then of mechanics, and finally of purpose. The fortress that had once filled notebooks and briefings was now simply a relic in a hangar, a prisoner of a war it had long outlived. In the final months of 1945, when Allied forces overran the test base, they found what remained of it. The wings dismounted, the cockpit stripped for study, fragments scattered among the debris of other unfinished dreams. German engineers had continued to take measurements even as the front drew closer. As if one more page of notes might delay the inevitable. But the war was ending, and the lessons of the fortress no longer belonged to them alone. The machine that had arrived in secrecy 2 years before would now pass into legend, its influence scattered like its rivets across 1,000 airfields. The tested B-17s never flew again. Their metal was salvaged, their engines melted into raw material for reconstruction, yet their echo endured, not in the skies, but in the memory of the men who had touched them. To the engineers and officers who had studied it, the fortress remained an object of reluctant admiration. It was not the enemy's cruelty they remembered, but his craftsmanship, the way the bomber seemed to combine endurance and precision, power and restraint. Years later, when peace had softened the language of enmity, surviving Luftwaffe veterans would speak of it with almost reverence. It was a flying machine with the soul of an army, one of them recalled. He had flown fighters for Germany, had seen fortresses fill the air over Bremen and Cologne, and yet, in age, he remembered not their destruction, but their discipline. They moved as if guided by one will, he said. It was not a machine of men. It was a machine of purpose. In museums today, fragments of those captured aircraft still exist. A turret here, a section of fuselage there, a scrap of metal with faded serial numbers from another century. Behind glass, they seem ordinary, but for those who know their story, they represent more than the sum of their components. Each rivet, each plate, each inch of wiring is a small monument to a civilization that turned cooperation into armor. The B-17 had taught the world that defense, when disciplined, becomes offense. It revealed that protection itself could be a weapon, that a formation flying in unity could be more lethal than a single pilot flying in brilliance. In its wake, no air force would ever again build without considering the power of system over instinct, of coordination over courage. The fortress had not just changed air combat, it had redefined it. For Germany's airmen, that truth came too late. But for those who lived to reflect upon it, the lesson outlasted defeat. They understood, finally, that the fortress was not a symbol of American power alone. It was the expression of a new world order, one in which technology, industry, and collective discipline would determine the fate of nations. In the years that followed, as Europe rebuilt from the ashes, the skies became peaceful once more. Yet the shape of that peace bore the shadow of the B-17. It had shown that the future would belong to those who could organize, sustain, and endure. Jet bombers, nuclear deterrence, the networks of early warning and mutual defense, all of them carried echoes of the same philosophy born inside that aluminum fuselage. And somewhere, in the quiet hangars of restoration yards and museums, the fortress endures still, polished, preserved, no longer a weapon, but a witness. Visitors walk around it in silence, tracing the lines of its wings, reading the names once painted beneath its windows. Memphis Belle, 909, Shoo Shoo Baby. To them it is history. To the men who once faced it, it was revelation. It had proven that war was no longer won by singular genius or by the courage of one pilot against another. It was won by systems, by the alignment of effort, by the willingness of many to act as one. The fortress had embodied that truth before anyone else could see it. In the end, the Germans who had flown the captured bomber understood this better than most. They had tested it, respected it, and learned from it. What began as curiosity ended in comprehension. They had sought to understand how it fought. What they discovered was why it endured. They thought it was just a bomber, until they flew it and saw the world it carried inside.